Hello, everyone. This is Professor LEC, and this is Chapter 2 of U.S. Government Class, PS1113 for Langston University. In Chapter 2, we're going to go over the history, what created the Constitution, the history that eventually became the Constitution, and the Constitution itself. This chapter is needed so that you will have a somewhat understanding of the background of the Constitution and where all the provisions came from. Without this basic understanding of what was happening at the time, it would just look as if the Constitution just came out of thin air. And in reality, this short period of time in which we kind of discuss how the Constitution was developed actually developed from thought of philosophers and religious individuals for over 2,000 years. It is the culmination of Western civilization thought that created the Constitution. And to just simply say that the Constitution was original American thinking that just started out of nowhere is a fallacy. And in reality, the Constitution, how it was developed, was an extraordinary thing that just truly how the parts itself, as we understand it, didn't come into pure thought until John Locke brought forward with it about 100 years or 150 years prior. And then Rousseau brought it up to what we have a basic understanding of the social contract 100 years prior to the Constitution. So let's get with it. We're going to use PowerPoint in this. It allows me to hit certain points. It is not the main focus of what this lecture is, but it will help you through it. This will be one of the longer lectures here. So I suggest placing me on pause, go get some popcorn, go get some water, something. Because this, usually I try to limit my lectures to no more than 15 to 20 minutes. This will last much longer than that because there's a lot to explain. And when we meet each other again here soon during our next class meeting, more can be explained at that time. So let's get ready. I'm going to start showing my screen, sharing my screen with you so that you can see where I am. And then I will switch it over to pure mode. There we go. So right now, this is chapter 2, the front cover of our book. Now, just to get through here, these are the basic learning objectives that we go through: identify the causes of the American Revolution and the ideas on which the United States and the Constitution are based, identify the components of the Articles of Confederation and the reasons for their failure. Remember, the reasons for the failure of the Articles of Confederation is the reason why we have the Constitution today. Outline the issues resolved by the compromises during the writing of the Constitution. Describe the framework for government expressed in the Constitution, outline the arguments for and against ratification of the Constitution, and describe the processes by which the Constitution can be amended. All right. Now, let's start with the roots of the U.S. Constitution. Now, everybody has heard the phrase taxation without representation. It's something that is so overused, and it is tiresome, to be quite honest. now we have people today that like to use that phrase, "Oh, taxation without representation." We should change the Constitution, or we should get rid of these bums because they're taxing us too much. Blah 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 blah. Well, understand, it is legal, it is constitutional to tax you. And the funny thing is, everybody wants to go after the federal government for federal taxes. But in reality, what government body that's taxing you the most is the state government and local government. So before you get all upset when you see FICA, Medicare, Medicaid, and everything being taken out of your check, you need to look at your state taxes that are being taken out of your check, look at the sales taxes that you have to deal with, look at the little excise taxes on gas and other things that you have to do with. That is more taxation on the state level. But trade and taxation were issues that developed between the colonists and England during this period of time, between, let me set a good mark, 1750 to the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783. First steps, we're going to discuss the first steps towards independence, the First and Second Continental Congress, and the Declaration of Independence. Now, trade and taxation. There was this thought of how people did things called mercantilism at the time. Mercantilism is the understanding that if I, as a person, as a country, were to accumulate wealth, at the same time, someone else is losing wealth. And because of that, mercantilism restricted imports, exports, or just the flow of goods and services and money anywhere. It was so ingrained in the minds of many Europeans that mercantilism was this one little thing that every king in Europe followed, to the detriment. So mercantilism was the way it was until people came to the United States to colonize it, be it the French, be it the Dutch, be it the English. The reason why this was so important and changing is that in order to become wealthy, or in order to possess land in Europe in this time, or anywhere else in the world, you had to ask a king or lord or someone who is connected to the royal family to give you permission to own land and to develop it. Well, even in the colonies, England, and we're going to use England because we are derived, this country is derived from England, parceled out or gave contracts of land. Some of the basic contract or compact of land is the state of Virginia. Then the state of Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. All these were English compacts given to wealthy or influential individuals, most of them that the British monarchy did not want around, and gave them to develop in America. Well, these people like Penn, Johnson, many others came to the United States, developed, established colonies, established small towns, and they started to parcel out land to individuals. Individuals went to these lands, and what they wanted to do is just simply make enough out of the land so that they can go back to England much more wealthier than they were. and live a good life. But a lot of people came over here to get away from the systems, the government, just for just the regular type of society that English society was about. It was mostly religious people running away, but it was a lot of uh, opportunistic people who wanted to establish something new for themselves. So when they got here to this country and was parceled out a little land, they went, created their lives, created their homes, grew crops, grew livestock, was able to feed their families, then had enough surplus that they could go to market and trade it. But before you know it, individuals were becoming wealthy and acquiring more land and becoming wealthy, or going out to the frontiers of land, trapping or killing animals and trading for their fur. So it was a concept in which you could come to this land, stake your claim, and become very wealthy. And this is something that has proven over time more and more. And it's now a part of an American value of individualism, liberty, self determination. So, as these people were beginning to be wealthy landowners more and more people came over here, governments started to form. And as more governments started to form, more people were putting things together, trade was increasing back and forth, flying in the face of mercantilism. Because in this case, wealth was being generated and created without taking it from anyone else. So the idea of mercantilism was false. I didn't mean to spend that much time on it, but you have to understand why people came here. They knew they could stake their claim. They knew they could become wealthy, and they knew they could be free to do whatever they want religiously or personally. So from the early 1600s all the way up to the 1750s, this idea developed in all the people who came here, even among people who were brought here against their will, be it African slaves or indentured servants from England. And when this took hold, it fed this attitude of being someone who can make their own way. And that became a cornerstone of America. But in the 1850s, I mean 1750s, the French and Indian War began. Now, what it was, the French Indian War, was a war against England. It was one of the first global wars. It was the 7 Years' War in Europe against French and England. And since French colonies and English colonies were around the world, it involved everyone. And a lot of battles took place here. Some of the future revolutionary heroes were in this war, like George Washington, uh, like James Madison, and others were involved in this war. But this war was very costly for British to fight. And after England had won this war, they had huge debt. And they felt like the colonies in America needed to pay their fair share. So England, without any representation of any of the colonists in Parliament, start passing acts such as the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, eventually the Tea Act, all these different acts to have colonies to pay their fair share. So the rallying cry, no taxation without representation, means that England, by the authority of the crown, simply started to tax the colonists without their say in Parliament or without listening to the colonial governments that had been established. The Stamp Act, Congress formed the first, some of the first steps towards independence was because of the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was this little stamp that had to be on every document, no matter what. And that would prove that you had paid the crown its due by placing that stamp on any document. This act was repealed less than a year and a half after it was put in place. But the first meetings of the Continental Congress began to form. And all the different grievances that the colonies had, be it the Stamp Act, be it the Sugar Act, be it in New York, the Military and Housing Act, where the military could come in and just stay in someone's house, or just I forget the term for it, but all these little acts from England without the representation or without hearing from the different legislators in the colonies were being enacted without their permission. Then in 1707, the Boston Massacre occurred, in which 5 colonists were killed. And it just simply started as a little incident where a British soldier kicked a child. People were upset, started to look like a threatening mob. The British soldiers fired on the crowd to kill 5. And as everyone knows, that one of the first persons to die for the revolution, which something that no one really mentioned until near or during the Civil War, was Atticus Crepus was the first one, was killed, was a black man who was a runaway slave. And eventually, with the help of Alexander Hamilton, the British troops were stood trial and they got off. So these are some of the grievances that formed the first Continental Congress. Also, committees were formed in the Continental Congress to correspond to build public opinion against Britain. Remember, most of the people in the colonies at this time wanted to be British. Remember, everybody's a British citizen. No one really wanted to leave England. But there were a few rabble-rousers that wanted to. And they were building strength in order to get people to leave them. Then the Boston Tea Party happened. Because of the Tea Act, which gave the West Indian Trade Company exclusive rights to sell tea. Remember, at the time, the United States and even Caribbean were selling tea, not only to other colonies, but trading back and forth to China during this time. When England took that away and made the East Indian Tea Company the only company in the colonies or in the British Crown that could sell tea, it caused an issue. And of course, we had the Sons of Liberty at the time, dressed up as natives take seas over boats that were filled with tea and threw the tea into the harbor, which was over today considered almost $20 million of tea. This, of course, angered England. England said, hey, you know what? You need to turn over the people who did this and pay for the tea. Of course, people in Boston, the Massachusetts colony itself, said, no, we're not going to do that. The intolerable acts or the corrosive acts of 1774 were passed in retaliation with this. It closed down Boston Harbor. It brought troops into Boston to quarter, that's the term I was looking for earlier, to quarter into private homes. And the quartering act, the first quartering act came out in 1764 in New York, where New Yorkers also protest against this. And the legislator in New York totally objected to it. A new New York governor came in and from England and ended the state legislature of New York and enforced the Quartering Act there. Now, under the coercive acts of 1774, same thing was happening in Boston Harbor and in the colony of Massachusetts. Now, in the first and the Second Continental Congress, parts 1 and 2, the First Continental Congress met in 1774, 56 delegates, but not all of the states were involved. And what they wrote during this Congress was called the Declaration of Rights and Resolves. Basically, they sent a letter to Parliament and the King that says, hey, look, we have these rights as English citizens. And we would like to resolve the issues that we are having between you and us now. Remember, most people did not want to revolt against England. They were English citizens and they loved England. They didn't want to leave. So in the First Continental Congress, these were the first things that were involved. And right before the Second Continental Congress began in May 1775, the first shots heard around the world had begun. The Battle of Langston and Concord, which occurred within a couple of days of each other, happened a full month before the Second Continental Congress. And it just showed proof that England was not going to back down and was not going to change. So during the second meeting of the Continental Congress, the Olive Branch Petition was drawn up and was approved. And in this Olive Branch Petition, it was again, most people were saying, please stop these actions. Please withdraw the troops. We just want fair and equal shake. And of course, England, the Parliament, the King ignored it. Thomas Paine came out with his famous common sense to just simply, and funny thing is, Thomas Paine was never an American citizen or an English citizen, but that's okay. He wrote a pamphlet that just summed up everything that England was doing and told everyone that it was common sense that any acts such as these should not be tolerated. Then later, within the next year, during the second time of the Continental Congress, the Declaration of Independence was written up. Now, the principal author was Thomas Jefferson, but also one of the associated authors of this was Benjamin Franklin. They received the ideas of the Declaration of Independence from John Locke with social contract theory, life, liberty, and property. In the second treatise of government, John Locke spells this out in detail. And we're not covering John Locke here in this class. But John Locke, if you want to understand how the idea of the Constitution should work, read the Second Treatise of Government. And it's a good description of how the Constitution was framed. But with the Declaration of Independence, it simply listed all the different grievances that England had done, all the violations that they had done. And it just simply said, we will no longer tolerate it since you are no longer listening to us. The Declaration of Independence was the first drafts were brought up in 1775 in June, written, clarified, no, my bad, 1776 in June, written, clarified, drawn up. And at that time, given consideration. And then on 1776, July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was approved by the Continental Congress, and it was messaged to England that we were a free society. We're going to be a free, independent nation. And because of that, we now had to create a government. Because even though we were considered a free nation, we declared independence, we only had one battle against England, which was the Battle of Concord and Lexington. But we really didn't have an army. And we truly didn't have leadership. Also, we did not have a strong central government at all. We didn't have any of this created, so we had to create it. So in the Second Continental Congress, we came up with one with the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation included all the states which are in rebellion, which were the first 13 colonies, that we were going to fight together against England, and that we were going to be as one. Problem is with the Articles of Confederation is that it gave so much power to the states, extremely large amount of power to the states, that the central government was basically inept. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no power to tax, no power to regulate commerce between the states, no executive to implement the laws. There was no judicial system and no coercive power over the states. Now let's look at that. No power to tax. That means there was not a central body to centrally collect taxes and to pay for an army. What had to be done is that each state decided on their own to send money for the standing army. And one of the major persons that kept the army going, the Continental Army, was George Washington. George Washington frequently wrote people he knew in each state capital during this time to send money for resources to help them. Also at this time, since there was no power to regulate commerce, any travel of goods and services, and let's look at it from this point of view. Let's say Virginia needed to send up to the colony of Massachusetts armaments, ammunition, and just food for the Continental Army that was up there. So if Virginia sends this up there, it has to go through the state of Pennsylvania in order to get to the state of Massachusetts. Well, if that convoy goes through the state of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania will tax that convoy. And in order for it to go to the state of Massachusetts, once it passed over into Massachusetts, Massachusetts would tax it too. So by the time it gets to George Washington, all of that had been double taxed. Each state would tax it. And if the only way they could pay for taxes is to trade out some of the goods and services that were involved there, very little was getting to the Continental Army. So there was a major problem with the Articles of Confederation. There were no executive to implement laws. Basically, there was no president. That's incorrect. There was a president under the Articles of Confederation. It was a person that was voted on by the Congress under the Articles that served a one-year term, but the executive had no power. There was no judicial system to resolve disputes between the colonies and individuals. And there were no coercive power over the states. Basically, the Articles of Confederation was not the superior law of the land. So the federal government under the Articles of Confederation could not do anything. But understand also, and here's something you have to remember, a lot of people don't know this, under the Articles of Confederation, we were the United States of America. So essentially, two social contracts that the United States had were the Articles of Confederation and our current Constitution. Rebellion in the states. So after we were, and George Washington mainly, overcame a lot of issues, we eventually won the Revolutionary War. Thank God that we had James Madison in France to negotiate a treaty that allowed French troops to come over and help us, and the French Navy to help us, gave us gold to help us to pay for our troops, and we owed them a big debt without any way of paying them. But in 1783, the Revolutionary War ended, and now we had to go forward and govern. Now we were trying to govern under this very imperfect document. Not to say the current Constitution is perfect today, but it was the worst. Without central authority, there was no one to make sure that the states abide by the laws. Without any taxation, there was no central government that could do anything. State governments had their own power, and state law was the rule. To the point during Shays' Rebellion, which occurred in 1785, where farmers protest farm foreclosures in several states, Shay's followers just simply shut down the different courts that were foreclosing on land. There were no state militia to stop them. There was no federal army to stop them. And this simply just spread out through the countryside until eventually it was quashed by time. During this time, because of this, thinkers such as Alexander Hamilton, Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, all of them knew that we had to do better. So in 1787, they all got together with many delegates from different states, and it was time to create a new constitution. Now, during during this time of writing the Constitution, uh, the founding fathers all went into what is known today as Constitutional Hall, and they closed all the doors, all the windows, and kept everything absolutely private. Now, their mission was to simply amend the Articles of Confederation. But Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and many others agreed that, no, we're going to get rid of the Articles of Confederation and we're going to do something better. So all these people got together in secret with no news getting out to anyone and start writing a new constitution. And when the Constitution was written, we had to look at the different motives of the framers, the different plans that went through, the compromises, and eventually a lot of unfinished business. Characteristics and motives of the framers. You know what? I'm just going to go some of this. I'm not going to follow this. Yes, most of these framers were all white and wealthy males. Most young, not correct. Some were slave owners, correct. Relatively educated, correct. Social motives, maintain social order with which benefited them, yes. Economic motives, maintain property rights which benefited them, yes. This is correct. Now, the sticking point at the very beginning is to determine what kind of Congress was going to occupy under the new government. The Virginia plan, which was brought up by the representatives of Virginia, says that we are going to have members of Congress based on population. Well, if you had a large state like Virginia, like New York, those states would have most power in Congress. The New Jersey plan just simply said that we should have equal representation coming from all states. So the Great Compromise that came up created a bicameral legislature, two House of Representatives, which was made it represented all population, no, which its members were elected based on population, and a Senate in which two members came from each state, which were all elected by the state legislators. So in one house, each state was given equal vote. In the other house, it was all based on population. Division of power, even in Congress. It was kind of a check. It was smart. Another issue was slavery. The biggest issue is, should we get rid of it? Most of the northern states did, southern states did not. To compromise on it so we can become one country, they compromised that we would not have any slavery for about 20 years. I mean, no limits on slavery or the slave trade for 20 years. Bring in as many slaves as you can. Also, the 3/5 compromise, because in the House of Representatives, if you counted a slave as one person, the South would have the most number of people because not only of free people, but of slaves. So in order to balance this out, a compromise came about called the 3/5 compromise, which means a slave was only seen 3/5 of a person. So in order for one person to be counted, you must have 3 two people to be counted as one person. So you would have 1.1/5 of a person with two slaves. Insane. But this is the compromise they made in order to have a country. Hate doing it from PowerPoint. All right, one person, one executive is they wanted to choose a president. They wanted a committee of presidents, 3 people. They eventually decided on 1. And they decided as one person as an executive. This first person to serve a 4-year term. They did not want a person to be elected directly from the people out of fear of mob rule. So they created an electoral college, which consists of members, independent members, that consist of the number of members of Congress that a state, congressional districts and senators that a state has to fulfill the electoral college members of a state. And all those people come together to choose the president. And they chose a way to impeach the president for high crimes and misdemeanors. What is not mentioned here, of course, is that in building the Constitution, that an independent judiciary was created and a Supreme Court was to be seated. And the Supreme Court was in any way to be separate and independent and a third check on the Congress and the executive. And the Supreme Court, which was created out of this, was to stay independent by making sure that Congress could never restrict their term or their funding. Now, the Constitution, how it's structured and the basic principles. 1, the Constitution created a federalist system. That means that you have the federal system and you have the state system, and each level is sovereign to themselves. Sovereignty, what sovereignty means is power of a central government body over a specific geographical area. That's what sovereignty means. So say for Oklahoma, for instance, Oklahoma controls Oklahoma. The state legislator, the governor, and the Oklahoma Supreme Court creates, enforces, and interprets the laws created within Oklahoma. That's because of the federal system. For as long as those laws do not violate the Constitution, Oklahoma has full control over itself. The federal government, however, has full control over the country as a whole. And it is the sovereign of the overall country and is considered the highest law in the land. Separation of powers. You have the executive, judicial, and congressional branches, legislative branches. These powers were separated so that not one group would hold so much power to wield over everyone else. Checks and balances. Each of these branches have different checks against the others. And this is how the powers work. So they can counteract one act of overindulgence of the other group. All right, Article 1 of the Constitution is the legislative branch. It is the largest article in the Constitution. It is the largest provision under the Constitution, and it is the most powerful one. Article 1 establishes the legislative branch. Article 2 establishes the executive branch and the presidency. Article 3 establishes the judiciary branch. Article 4 establishes the states and how they should be implemented. Article 5 establishes how the Constitution itself can be amended. Article 6 establishes the obligation of the Constitution. And Article 7 establishes the rules for ratification of the Constitution. Now, we've gone through a lot, and there are some things that I need you to cover. For one, I need you to read through the Articles of Confederation. You will be tested over. Also, I need you to read over Chapter 2, supporting documents. In it, you will see several Federalist papers, Federalist 10, Federalist 51. Please read over those documents. They're highly important. And read over the Constitution, not the Bill of Rights, not the first 10 amendments. I need you to read the Constitution in its original form. Know them very well, okay? Now, Article 1 is the legislative branch. The enumerated powers are powers that were specifically written in the Constitution. It's spelled out here. The necessary and proper clause gives the legislative branch to create laws that makes it necessary and proper to legislate and govern over the land. Implied powers are powers that are considered implied that the federal government has, such as this. Everyone loves to use this example, telecommunications. This is something that goes back and forth throughout the United States, no matter what. So who regulates that? Where does it say they regulate? There was nothing about telecommunications in the Constitution, but it is something that crisscrosses the country, which under the Constitution, the federal government has the right to regulate commerce. And since it goes over multiple states, this is an implied power under Congress to regulate telecommunications. And that's what an implied power is. The executive branch. Under the executive branch, the president is the commander-in-chief of all armed forces, no matter what. At the end of the day, all generals report to the president of the United States. The president also has the authority to make treaties and to appoint people federally. Now, under authority to make treaties, that means the president can go out there and negotiate a treaty with any country at all. However, once that treaty has been negotiated, the president has to get approval from Congress, specifically the Senate, for that treaty. Federal appointments. The president can appoint, and this is the executive branch checked on the judiciary, federal judges or Supreme Court judges. But the Senate, which is Congress, has to approve any federal appointment, pretty much all of them. Also, the executive branch execute all the laws faithfully. Believe it or not, the federal branch, the executive branch, out of policy at times, may not enforce certain policies, such as one of the things President Obama did back in 2014. He created what is called an executive order. It's just simply an order given by a president that's written up to all the executive branch agencies to follow. And under that executive order, President Obama told the Justice Department and the different branches under the Justice Department that there will not be any enforcement of marijuana laws in states which enacted recreational or medicinal use of marijuana. Then the 4 years in which Trump came into office, he repealed that. And today, President Biden has reinstated that executive order. That is what the executive branch should do. And the judiciary branch, I really despise how they just cut that off. Under the judiciary branch, the Supreme Court must be established, which members of the Supreme Court had to be appointed by the president. It was up to Congress, even though it is legislated or written in the Constitution that any lower courts has to be established upon their requests. And lower courts were established by Congress for the judiciary branch to administrate over. That is very important. Article 4 through Article 7, full faith and credit clause, which simply means that whatever contract that you've made in one state, it will be honored in another state. The supremacy clause means that the Constitution and the federal government is the supreme on the law of the land, and the amendment process, which we covered. Ratifying the US Constitution, well, after the Constitution was written, after Benjamin Franklin left Constitutional Hall, he ran into a woman. And an old woman said to asked Mr. Franklin, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? Mr. Franklin said, we've given you a republic. Remember that, a republic, constitutional republic. Let's see if you can keep it. Well, right out of the damn gate, there was a conflict. It was a conflict between people, federalists, who wanted a strong central government, and anti-federalists, who wanted weaker central government, but more power to the states. Now, in order to sell the Constitution, the Federalist Papers were written by Madison, by Hamilton, by Jay, and others to sell the Constitution. And these papers were put in pamphlet and spread throughout the colonies in newspapers and in mailboxes. So they could influence the individual state legislators to ratify the US Constitution. Please look under Federalist 10 to understand the arguments that led to the Constitution. Federalist 51 is very interesting because it goes against an argument about having virtuous people just running the government, but not everyone else. Under that, Madison clearly shows that it doesn't take a virtuous person with a virtuous mind to help run the government, but individuals all together collectively can help run the government. This won support of the Constitution, but the Constitution still needed a hurdle to get over, and a final compromise was made with some the states of Connecticut and Vermont that a Bill of Rights must be adopted. If the Constitution is to be ratified by us, you must make sure you ratify a Bill of Rights, because in the states of Virginia, states of Connecticut, Vermont, they've had a Bill of Rights to protect individual citizens from the government. These are called civil liberties, and that's what the Bill of Rights are. So in 1789, the US Constitution was finally ratified. In 1791, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, were finally ratified. As I said, Federalists favored strong national government. Read the Federalist Papers 10 read the Federalist Papers 51. Anti-Federalists favored strong state government. Look at the Anti-Federalist Papers that I have in supplemental documents. It's called Brutus 1. That will be on your exam too. So definitely read it. Ratification process was contentious. Yes, ratification of the US Constitution in many states was very close, and it was very close to get over that hump of 9 states, 2/3, in order to get it ratified. The Federalist Papers consisted of 85 essays by Federalists, Hamilton, Madison, Jay. They all appeared in New York newspapers. They appeared in more than New York newspapers. They were pamphlets. They appeared in a lot of newspapers. Theoretically, they were scholarly. Yes, some of them were scholarly, some of them were not. Anti-Federalists responded with a critique of the Constitution, and they also appeared in pamphlets under the Brutus Notes. These are the first state. Delaware was the first state. Small states before others. New Hampshire was the 9th and final state. New York and Virginia ratified as well. Condition of ratification sought by all Federalists to protect civil liberties in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Remember, it was a compromise. Now, under the Constitution, there are 2 ways to amend the Constitution. There's an informal method and there's a formal method. A proposal, 2/3 members of both houses of Congress, 2/3 of all state legislators can create a proposal to the Constitution. All constitutional amendments have been 2/3 members of the House of Representatives, voted on the amendment, signed by the president, sent out and approved by 2/3 of the states. But 2/3 of state legislators can come together, create an amendment in which the federal government would have to pass, and that's never been done because you can't get all the states to agree. You can't get 2/3 of the states to agree, even if they're Republican or Democrat. Ratification, vote in state legislature and voting and ratifying conventions. Well, ratification of an amendment has always been voting in state legislature. As in voting and ratifying conventions, we don't want that. And it has not been done. And the reason for that is the last time we had a constitutional amendment, constitutional convention to ratify or to change the Constitution, we have our new Constitution from the Articles of Confederation. There are different methods of amending the Constitution. Judicial interpretation. The Supreme Court can decide if laws are unconstitutional or constitutional. Social and cultural changes, legislation can change. Technological change can happen, like understanding what free speech means. And that's it. Thank goodness. 1 hour, 19 minutes. As you all see, there are different ways how our Constitution can change. And of course, we're going to get more in depth in this later. In chapter 3, we're going to go over the Federalist system and how each level works. And then chapter 4 and 5, we're going to go over civil liberties and civil rights. But for chapter 2, which we just completed, it sounded very rickety and rockety, and a lot of things were left out just because of space of time. But in order to get a very good understanding of how people were thinking, look under Federalist Paper 10. Look under Federalist Paper 51. Look under Brutus 1. Look under the Articles of Confederation, how it was started out in the first place. Look at the original set of the constitutions before the Bill of Rights, and then look at the Bill of Rights themselves. why it was important to place that into the Constitution. And remember, these are all very important for your quizzes and your upcoming midterm exam. If you have any questions about this lecture or anything else, please email me at jerry.elick@langston.edu, or just simply send an email through Canvas, or schedule an appointment time with me, and we can talk together. Until next time, remember to do well, to think critically, and God bless you, and I will see you later.